I've been working at a clothing store in the mall for about 5 weeks. I was your typical high school graduate who wasn't sure if they wanted to go to college or not. I was just kind of working because I didn't really have anything else to do. A little background on me. I'm a pretty large guy. I'm 6 foot tall, and I'm not some kind of gym freak, but I do consider myself more fit than most. I probably work out 3 or 4 times a week, and this has honestly been really cool, being seen as the tough guy. The day this happened, there were a lot more people than usual. I remember there being customers everywhere, and it just felt like there was no ending the day. I remember me and my coworkers rushing around and having this feeling of, wow, we don't have enough staff for this. It eventually slowed down as the day came to an end, though. And it was always nice because you kind of get a cool down. That is, if you work the entire day like I do. This happened during that slow. When I was somewhere between the late afternoon and night. Probably had to have been 6 or 7. The sun was still out, seeing as it was still summertime. A man who was even taller than I was walked into the store, and from the second he stepped foot on the premises, I knew that he had bad intentions. His body language was sending out a lot of freaky signals, and I started getting ready for some kind of confrontation. As much as I hated these kinds of things, I knew that everyone was going to look to me to save the day, considering most of my other coworkers were female and the only other guy was kind of a weakling. This ominous man that had walked into the store was wearing a black sweatshirt and a dark pair of jeans. I at least remember that much. He walked over one of the clothing racks and literally threw it to the floor. Everyone in the store turned and looked at him, and he just kind of stood there for a second. I yelled and started walking over to him, and I saw him reach into his pocket. I'm not sure what kind of pistol he pulled out, I just remember him firing at me multiple times. I looked out and was only hit once in the arm, at least at first. I managed to get back behind the register area to take cover. For some reason, he believed that he could fire through the counter. And so, he tried. But the bullets started ricocheting. A couple of them hit some of the other coworkers. They were all desperately trying to find cover, and one of them even ran away from the scene entirely. I knew this was going to be a bad situation because I remember having a conversation with one of the mall cops one time. They weren't allowed to carry guns. So, if someone managed to get a gun inside of the mall and started opening fire, we were all going to have to wait for the actual police to show up. I knew the next 15 to 30 minutes were going to determine if I lived or not. I stayed behind the counter for as long as I could, but I heard him coming toward me. My heart pounded in my chest faster than I had ever felt it before. I was mortified. Terrified that I was about to die. And for no good reason at that. Some random guy with a gun decides to shoot up a clothing store in a mall. Who does that? A few minutes have gone by and he hadn't fired another bullet. I wasn't sure if he had been reloading or he ran out of bullets or maybe he was saving a few. I had no idea how many he had in a clip. I just remember the sound of footsteps running toward my direction. I knew he was coming my way, and I wasn't sure what I was even capable of doing at that point. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I figured the best chance I had was waiting for him to get on the other side of the counter, where he could see me, and then I was going to tackle him. I knew that wasn't the best option, but I'm not sure what other options I had. For some reason, he jumped over the counter. He landed right next to me, and this was perfect for me. He was close enough that we could get into a scuffle now, and maybe I had a chance at surviving this. I remember grabbing his leg and getting him on the floor. He kicked me in the head. That hurt like hell. It almost knocked me out altogether, but I managed to keep going, probably only because of the adrenaline my body was releasing. Once I got him onto the floor, I saw that he had dropped his gun. Considering the fact that he hadn't fired, I figured he had to have been out of ammo and too hyped up to reload in the middle of a shooting. We fought on the floor for a good few minutes before someone else decided to join in. I don't know why no one joined in sooner. I really could have used the help. It was just me and this deranged, psychotic killer fighting on the floor of this mall for a good little while. He wasn't the strongest guy in the world. But I was also fighting with a bullet wound in my arm, so he had an extreme advantage over me. He probably would have killed me with his bare hands had someone else not joined in and helped me. We managed to knock him unconscious, get the gun away from him, and we waited for the police to arrive. I remember this little experience being the talk of the area for a couple of weeks. There were quite a few newspaper articles written about it all. I even got interviewed in one of them, and the journalist called me a hero. And to be honest, nothing made me happier in the world than to read those words. I have that article cut out and framed in my bedroom now. The guy was arrested, prosecuted, and I'm pretty sure he got life in prison. People started treating me like a real hero after this. And in all honesty, I kind of felt like one. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had not been there to take that guy on. There was no way any of my coworkers would have been able to fight with this guy. And if he had complete control of the situation, he probably could have taken a hostage or done something much worse. And ever since this experience, I haven't viewed my physical strength as something that makes me cool or better than anyone. I view it as a way that I can protect people. I think this may have been the experience I needed because I think I want to become a police officer after this. This is a somewhat horrifying but also hilarious story that happened to my best friend. Me and he were sports players together when we were younger and have always been close ever since. His name is Brian, and we were about 20 years old when his story happened. He had just gotten a job at GameStop. He was really excited about being able to get discounts on games and even to be able to play games a few days early in some cases with the new releases. Me and he both loved playing video games together, and it was probably a dream job in a lot of ways. Now, my friend Brian is a great guy in a lot of ways, but he isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer if you catch my drift. On the football field, or the basketball court, or even in Call of Duty, he was probably the best. But when it came to reading a book or passing a test, well, let's just say that he would be on the bench if he could for that kind of stuff. Things started out one day when we both decided that we wanted to start playing horror games. I had watched a Let's Play of Resident Evil. I thought it would be a really fun idea. He wasn't a big fan of horror, but he was willing to play whatever games we could get, especially because he got such a nice employee discount at GameStop. We had spent one Friday night playing Resident Evil until 4 o'clock in the morning. I didn't have anywhere to be the next day, and he wasn't working until 12, so we figured that there was no harm, no foul. Now, before I go any further, I would just like to say that your brain is like a sponge. You absorb information and stimuli and process it in various ways. Sometimes, your brain can process information in a way that you might not expect it to do. Sometimes things can really stick with you. They can really play a role in your psyche. And I think Resident Evil did that for my friend Brian. So, he worked that shift the next day. And when I talked to him that night when he got off of work, he started telling me that he thought someone had been murdered at GameStop. Again, not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I started asking him more about the details, and the only evidence that he found was a random pile of blood. It was located outside the store on the side of the building where most people don't usually go. He started telling me that he thought his manager had murdered someone. I jokingly told him that we shouldn't play Resident Evil anymore. We decided for a different game that night, and I didn't ask him to play Resident Evil again. And he never asked me to do so either. So, whatever psychological change happened to my friend, it took place over the course of playing Resident Evil one time for a couple of hours. Weeks literally went by, and he was still talking about the pile of blood that he saw outside of GameStop. It would only happen on random occasions, according to him. I tried telling him that there must have been some kind of explanation for it. I mean, maybe someone was dumping spaghetti sauce or something. There was a pizza place in the same strip mall. He didn't buy it though. He was thoroughly convinced that someone had been murdered, and the murderer was draining out a small amount of blood and then putting it in this one spot outside of GameStop. He sounded really serious when he talked about it, but he never called the police or anything. He told me he asked his manager once about it, and his manager told him not to worry about it. It just didn't seem like that big of a deal. But I remember this one time that we had been playing Call of Duty for about 3 hours one night. He started talking about it in detail and how much it freaked him out. He told me that he was having nightmares regularly and that he didn't like working at GameStop anymore. I tried telling him that this wasn't a big situation and he was just being paranoid, but he wouldn't listen to me. It wasn't very long before he decided to quit that job at GameStop. It was really sad because he no longer got any of the perks of being an employee. This also meant that I didn't get any of the perks of being a friend of an employee there, which also sucked. But Brian was very insistent that something horrible was going on there, and he didn't want to end up getting murdered for knowing too much about some kind of criminal activity. A couple of days later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I just had to know where this pile of blood was coming from. It turned out that one of the other GameStop employees had been someone I went to high school with, and I messaged them on Facebook. I asked them about this mysterious pile of blood and everything. And then he told me this. The truck driver who occasionally delivers the games and merchandise to this GameStop has a truck that isn't the greatest. It isn't that large or anything, and it's the same one that always makes deliveries to the specific GameStop for some kind of logistical reasons. The truck gets a certain amount of rust for some reason, and the truck driver cleans the truck off in this one particular spot every time he delivers there. When I found that out, I laughed uncontrollably for about 1 hour. Brian literally found a pile of rust and thought it was blood. As much as I love that guy like a brother and respect him as a person, things like this are why I have such a hard time taking him seriously. I only just messaged this guy on Facebook a day ago, and I haven't even spoken to Brian since. He works at a restaurant now, and it's been really busy there. I'm not sure if I should even tell him though. A part of me really wants to tell him and make fun of him, but I don't want to hurt his feelings too bad. I might low-key send him a link to a video about rust and see if he connects the dots. And that's the story about my friend Brian, who isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, and how he was convinced that people were being murdered and their blood was being dumped outside of GameStop, but it was actually just a pile of rust. So, I have this friend. They're a little bit off the wall. One of those conspiracy theorists, very much into the paranormal types of people. I'm talking about the kind of person that watches the X-Files and thinks it's probably true. Of course, she dresses it up like she's just playing around and doesn't actually believe in it wholeheartedly, but I'm smart enough to know that she uses humor as a way to distance herself from what she actually believes. I think some of the crazy shit that she says, she actually thinks. No, this isn't to disparage her or anything, she's an otherwise really nice person. And she only starts talking about this kind of stuff once you get her going. Sometimes we can go days without ever talking about ghosts or aliens or anything else like that. But if someone starts talking about feeling a spirit in the room, that's the end of it for the night. I just wanted to give you that background because I feel it's very pertinent to the story. Well, this particular friend happens to work at Walmart. There have been a lot of recent changes lately, and what happened is that she got stuck on the night shift. I'm sure you can imagine how this went. They put someone that's into paranormal stuff on the night shift, and the next thing you know, they have 1,000,001 different stories about ghosts and monsters and everything else. That's kind of how it went for the first few weeks. Every time I hung out with her, she would talk about how horrible it was to be working on the night shift, and then she would start talking about all of the monsters and creatures that she would see out of the corner of her eye. I just remember thinking to myself multiple times, if she actually believes that she sees stuff while she's at work. Well, as time went on, she became much more mild with the stories. I guess she had just gotten used to working the night shift at Walmart. And then I remember there being one party that we went to. It was me, her, and a bunch of other people from our friend group. It wasn't one of those crazy alcohol-filled adventures as you see in movies or anything like that. It was much more of a bunch of friends getting together and hanging out. I mean, we're all adults and everything. The person whose house we were hanging out at owned the home, but I don't know what else we could have called it other than a party. Anyway, my one perceptive friend had a little bit too much to drink this night. And she started going on about her job, like usual. And then all of a sudden, things took a turn for the worse. She started talking about seeing a dead person walking around the store. I remember her talking about the exact details of how he died. She claimed that he had shot himself in the heart to kill himself. And she saw him walking around Walmart late at night when no one else was around. Some of our other friends were less hesitant to call her on her bullshit. And she started getting really offended. She left that night after, and in retrospect, I probably should have stopped her from driving home considering that she was extremely intoxicated. If I'm gonna be honest with you, that didn't even cross my mind until the next morning. This guy that committed suicide by shooting himself in the heart became the only thing she ever talked about when it came to the ghosts and whatnot of her night shift job at Walmart. And I found it really strange. It was one of the less believable stories that she would tell us about. I mean, she would always talk about there being a pack of wolves in the forest on the other side of the Walmart parking lot, but it just didn't have the same glamour that the suicide guy did. The thought of there being some zombie walking around Walmart at night that only she could see seemed as ridiculous as it sounds. And I just kind of chalked it up to her own mental problems for it all. Well, a couple of months went by. She was still on this suicide heart guy kick, even after all this time. I decided to do some research on this specific Walmart to prove to her that no one had ever committed suicide on or near the premises, especially in that way. I remember getting my laptop out one night and Googling this local Walmart's address. I'm going to spare any identifying details for obvious reasons. I read about every single death that had occurred on the premises since the place was built in the 1980s. I read about one guy who accidentally died of a stroke in '85. I read about there being a terrible accident with a forklift about 7 years ago. I didn't see anything about anyone committing suicide at any point in time. I was just about done with my search, and I was in that post-research phase where I was just kind of reading around random information aimlessly. And that was when I came across the news archives that I couldn't believe. It had been written during the time that this Walmart was being built. The story went like this. One of the crewmen who were responsible for building the Walmart had some serious problems. His only son died at 10 years old, and I guess this guy never really recovered after that. He had taken his own life after working the graveyard shift one night. The article talked about him being the only person that was willing to work all the way to 12 a.m. and sometimes later. He had a shotgun in his truck and then he committed suicide right in the forest nearby. And here's the craziest part, he shot himself in the chest exactly the way my friend had described. I haven't told my friend about this. I know I would never hear the end of it. But I just find it so strange that her weird, goofy little interest in the paranormal somehow uncovered something like this. Now, every time she starts talking about ghosts or the paranormal, I make sure to start listening for something that might be true. Don't get me wrong, I try to filter out the obvious hoopla, but now that I've seen her get something unbelievably right once, I'm just waiting for her to do it again.